Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name is Herb Bateman. This is the second in a three-part video series of a conference held in 2015. It's the Let's Know the Bible Conference featuring Dr. Darrell L. Bock, Professor of New Testament Studies from Dallas Theological Seminary. During this conference, Darrell focused on three aspects of the Gospels. We wanted to look at an examination of the Gospels as it applied to Jesus. In our last video, we looked at how to read the Gospels. And we learned how to read the Gospels as he discussed Jesus from the earth up versus heaven down. How to read the Gospels. In this second video, we're going to focus on how to interpret the Gospels. What got Jesus into trouble? It focuses on Jesus' actions in the last week of his life. And he focuses on the importance of Second Temple history and Second Temple literature. I trust you will find this video both rewarding, enlightening, and encouraging as you continue your study in the Gospels. Listen as Dr. Darrell Bock explains.
All right. So I want to talk about what I call cultural scripts. Cultural scripts are things that are a part of the culture that are natural for the people who operate in that culture, but people outside that culture would have no clue what's going on. And there are lots of cultural scripts. They aren't behind the text. They aren't under the text. They aren't in front of the text. They're embedded in the text. And so I want to illustrate a cultural script, and I thought about how to do this, given that I'm in Indiana. And this illustration is dedicated to Herb, okay, who is a Giants fan, okay, a New York Giants fan, okay. If I had thought about this, I would have done it with the Bears or the Colts, but I'm going to do it with the Giants. So here we go. So the Giants are going up to the frozen tundra to melt the cheeseheads. All right? Okay, that's a very theological sentence. The Giants are going up to the frozen tundra to melt the cheeseheads. Now, here's my point. You know immediately what I'm talking about. Okay? If I were to ask you, what's the topic that I'm talking about, you would tell me what? Football. Well, football means all kinds of things. What kind of football? American football. Okay, that's right. See, this is a global audience, all right? So you got to be sensitive. Anyway, so it's American football. Now, you know that because you're a part of this culture. And notice that nowhere in that sentence, the Giants are going up to the frozen tundra to melt the cheeseheads. Nowhere in that sentence, in the wording of that sentence, is there an indication that we're talking about American football. But that's certainly what we're talking about, okay? Because you and I share the culture and the cultural clues that that combination of words has, you immediately get what I'm saying. But I tell my students in my class, if I were doing English as a second language exam in Saudi Arabia, and I gave this to a bunch of Saudi Arabians, and I even gave them an English-Arabic lexicon, English-Arabic dictionary, and they looked up the definition of every word in that dictionary, they still probably would not get what that sentence was about. Okay? That's a cultural script. It's embedded in the text, in the understanding of the way life works in this part of the world, and if you share the culture, you don't have to explain the triggers, okay? They're there and people get them. Now, there's a lot of that going on in the Gospels. There are cultural scripts embedded in the text that signal certain things or that have certain associations tied to them that then help to explicate or explain what's going on. And I want to look at a series of examinations of Jesus' actions both in the last week and leading into the last week, that show what got Jesus into trouble in the last week. And we're going to look at some of these things. Now, the basic orientation for this approach is the idea that Jesus shows who he is more often than saying who he is. And there's actually a text that illustrates this. In Matthew 11, verses 2 to 6, which is paralleled, it's a parallel passage in Luke 7, 21 to 23, we get this exchange between some disciples that John the Baptist sent to Jesus while John the Baptist was in jail. Remember, John the Baptist was anticipating this Arnold Schwarzenegger-esque Messiah who was going to come and immediately bring judgment. Anyway, he sends these disciples to Jesus to ask the question, are you the one to come, or should we expect another? And the reply that he gets is, from Jesus is, not, I am the Messiah. In fact, I tell people, that John the Baptist didn't watch enough television. Okay? If he had watched enough television, he would have asked this question a completely different way. He would have asked it, are you the one to come, or should we expect another? Yes or no? Okay? If he had asked it that way, he'd have gotten a better answer. Okay, so what Jesus answers back to him is this: go and tell John what you have seen and heard. And then he goes through a list of stuff. The blind see, the lame walk, the gospel is preached to the poor. And most of these phrases are cultural scripts. They are embedded in passages in the book of Isaiah where God is describing what he's going to do in the era in which he comes to save. And so the picture is these eschatological acts, these acts that are the promise of God, where Isaiah is pointing to the time by what is happening. In other words, Jesus tends to show who he is versus talking about who he is, because at one level, talk is cheap. Okay? Words by themselves might or might not indicate who someone is, but if someone does stuff, that might show who he is. And that's actually how the Gospels often work. So if you understand the act and understand the context of the act, and you understand the cultural script embedded in the act, then you will understand what's going on. So we're going to look at a series of these that lead to a variety of reactions going on. It says, now think about the Sabbath for a second from a Jewish perspective and how important it was. It was viewed as a model based upon the creative act of God in Genesis 1. God rested on the seventh day. It was a part of the Ten Commandments. It was known as the Lord's Day because this was the day in which you rested and you worshiped and you contemplated what God had done and provided for you in life, etc. So what we're dealing with in the Sabbath incidents are important aspects of tradition, of Jewish tradition, that are really significant. The issue involved, the cultural script, is Jesus' claim of authority over holy time, over the divine calendar, and over a commandment of God. This was a day that God commanded be set aside. And so Judaism had built up a whole series of rules to deal with the idea that the Sabbath was a special day, was the Lord's Day, was the day of rest. And there are all kinds of examples of this. I'm going to read you one of these. In the Jewish tradition, there is in the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah is the written recording of the oral tradition, Jewish oral tradition about the law. It was written about in the latter part of the 2nd century AD. So around 180 to 200 is when it was recorded, but it deals with older traditions. Well, one of the traditions about the Sabbath is called the 40 less 1. The 40 less 1 is the idea of here are 39 things you are not allowed to do on the Sabbath so that the Sabbath is a day of rest. Okay, and I'm just going to read this to you. And it's a shame you can't see this text, but I'm also going to kind of do it to a beat because it's really cool to do it this way. So it says, the generative acts of labor prohibited on the Sabbath are 40 less 1. And here we go. He who sows, plows, reaps, binds sheaves, threshes, winnows, selects fit from unfit produce or crops, grinds, sifts, kneads, bakes, he who shears wool, washes it, beats it, dyes it, spins, weaves, makes 2 loops, weaves 2 threads, separates 2 threads, ties, unties, sews 2 stitches, tears in order to sew, you guessed it, 2 stitches. He who traps a deer, slaughters it, flays it, salts it, cures its hide, scrapes it, cuts it up. No hunting on the Sabbath. He who writes 2 letters, he who erases 2 letters in order to write, again, you guessed it, 2 letters. He who builds, tears down, puts out a fire, kindles a fire, he who hits with a hammer, and he who transports an object from one location to another. Lo, these are the 40 generative acts of labor, less one. Now, that is the Jewish tradition about the Sabbath and laboring on the Sabbath. And what you see when you go through this list is they thought about this. Okay? They actually seriously considered what was proper and improper on the Sabbath, because for Jewish people, it was a reflection of their worship and faithfulness of God to honor the covenant and honor the commandment that they should rest on the Sabbath. So there's a lot at stake here in thinking about what is involved here. So what we get are a series of events in Jesus' life in which things are done on the Sabbath that Jewish tradition said shouldn't be done. So, for example, when the disciples cut through walking on the road on the Sabbath, and his disciples pluck grain and sift it and eat it, okay, that's a violation of that 40 less 1 that I just read to you, that kind of thing. When Jesus heals on the Sabbath, and one of the synagogue rulers comes to him and says, there are 6 days on which to be healed, okay, come back tomorrow, basically. We're dealing with this rule of the Sabbath. And when Jesus responds to these charges, he says things like, and the Matthean version is the fullest version of this response, didn't you read how it happened that David and his men ate the showbread that was reserved only for the priests? I mean, Jesus explicitly makes the point, this is in violation to the written letter of the law. That's one example. Second scriptural example is, haven't you read in the prophets how they say, I desire mercy and not sacrifice? A third example, haven't you read how the priests labor on the Sabbath? It's not considered a violation of the Sabbath. So 3 reasons that he gives are, if you will, scriptural reasons arguing for the space that Jesus is occupying here. But then the last thing that he says in this sequence is a trump card. It goes beyond scriptural illustrations. And the last thing that he says is, and the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now think about what that claim is. We don't appreciate it because we don't appreciate the cultural script that is the Sabbath. The Sabbath is commanded by God. It's a part of the 10 Commandments. It's a reflection of God's work of creation. It is a distinctive of Jewish faith. And yet Jesus comes along and says the Son of Man, which is his way of referring to himself. Son of Man simply is an idiom meaning a human being, but he tells us in his ministry, he's alluding to the picture of the Danielic Son of Man of Daniel 7. That Son of Man rides clouds. In the Scripture, the only figure who rides clouds is deity. So we've got a deity-human mix. That's another cultural script, by the way. And so he says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. That's kind of like the healing of the paralytic. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Good observation. Good question. So if the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins, what might that be telling you about who the Son of Man is? If the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, and the Sabbath is the Lord's day commanded by God, who might that be telling you the Son of Man is? See how this works? And so there's cultural scripts embedded in these claims, and Jesus is showing who he is by what he does. In John 9, when Jesus heals a blind man, by the way, nowhere in the Old Testament is a blind man healed. In John 9, when Jesus heals the blind man, and he's being questioned and challenged, behind all of that is the idea in Judaism that God doesn't help a sinner. I've already mentioned this. But if God doesn't help a sinner, then how is it that the blind man can be healed by Jesus when he heals the blind man on a Sabbath? That's a good question. Okay? By the way, the Jews came up with an answer to that question. They said, he's not healing by the power of God. He's healing by the power of Beelzebul. Notice what that concedes. There's healing going on. There's even transcendent power at work in the healing that's going on. We're just debating where that transcendent power is coming from. Jesus, in response to these kinds of healings, said, if I cast out demons and Satan's doing it, that's Satan fighting against himself. That doesn't make any sense. But if it's not Satan, then it's got to be God. It's got to be coming from God. So all these things are things that Jesus is doing that have cultural scripts wrapped up in them that show you what's going on. And if you believe the claim, you're drawn to the idea that Jesus is divine and divine power is working through him. But if you're not drawn to the claim, then the problem is, well, he must be from below. And that gets you into trouble. So that's the first example, Sabbath incidents. The next example I've already talked about. It's the forgiveness of sins. And the backdrop here is, of course, that forgiveness is a prerogative of God, and forgiveness as a context of moving one to righteousness is taking place. Here's the second feature, the second cultural script, if you will, or variation on a cultural script. The way you sought forgiveness of sins in Judaism was to take a sacrifice to the temple and to participate in the temple worship. So not only is Jesus forgiving sins, but he's not using the temple to do it. Now, forgiveness of sins is another area that God is in charge of. How can he get away with doing that? And of course, the healing of the paralytic that we illustrated in the last lecture is part of the point. The way you can understand that I have authority to forgive sins, something you can't see, is by doing something unusual that you can see. So I say to the paralytic, get up and walk. And when he walks, his walk talks. And what it says is, the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. That's a cultural script. That's the point that's going on. And we've got several texts where Jesus is in the business of forgiving sin and does so quite openly. Not only do we have the healing of the paralytic, but the woman who anoints Jesus. In Luke 7, Jesus says to her, your sins are forgiven. And he gets the same reaction at that time that he got when he made that remark to the paralytic as well. And so the point in the background here is that forgiveness can be extended because of the authority of the Son of Man. But that anointing story tells you one other thing. And that is that when he tells the story and explains why he is comfortable letting this woman anoint him, he tells this parable story. And it goes like this. Basically, that there was a man who had a debt of 50 shekels, and there was a man, or 50 denarii, and another one who had 500. That's the difference between 2.5 months and 2.5 years worth of wage. And Jesus makes the statement, and their debt is forgiven. Who will love the person forgiving the debt more? And the response is, the one who is forgiven much loves much. Here's what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, the depth of a person's appreciation for what they have been forgiven will produce the depth of love they will have for the forgiver. And he turns to the Pharisee and he basically says, you think you've been forgiven little, so you love little. He turns to the woman and he says, she thinks she's forgiven much, and so she loves much, and she's done what she's done out of her sense of love. And the reason why that passage is important is because it shows this sequence. Forgiveness leads to repentance, which leads to conversion, and out of that movement of grace, the depth of forgiveness that woman experienced, she acts out of gratitude and love. And so it isn't that her works have saved her, but her works are evidence that she's gone through the sequence of forgiveness, repentance, and allegiance. An allegiance that's drawn to faith and love, and that's what Jesus commends. And he's saying all of this happens outside of anything happening in the cult in the temple. Okay? A cultural script. a cultural script that says the Son of Man not only has authority over the Sabbath, but the Son of Man also has authority over forgiveness of sins. Now, those are two areas: sacred space, sacred calendar, sacred forgiveness. Those are things that God has control of. And what we're doing is we're building the story of Jesus from the earth up through the cultural scripts that are embedded in the acts that Jesus is doing and in the way he's explaining how they're taking place. That got Jesus into trouble as well. You're walking all over God's territory, was the reaction. When you mess with the Lord's Day, you're walking all over God's territory. To which Jesus' reply is, you're right. When you're forgiving sins, you're walking all over God's territory. To which Jesus' reply is, you're right. Ponder anew what the Almighty can do. Okay, next. Here's a third area. The whole area of purity and other practices is another area. I'm picking out things in talking about this that we tend not to think about because we're simply not Jewish enough. Okay? All right? If you understand the cultural scripts coming out of the Old Testament and coming out of what's called Second Temple Judaism and where the faith of Judaism is at the time of Jesus, then you'll get some of these things that he's doing. But because we don't live in that world and we're not a part of that culture, we're like the Saudi Arabian trying to figure out what in the heck does the giants went up to the frozen tundra to melt the cheeseheads. What in the heck does that mean and what's it talking about? Okay? So we've got these key texts where Jesus engages on clean and unclean in Mark 7 equaling Matthew 15. Or there's a complaint about Jesus' religious practices. You don't fast like John the Baptist and the Pharisees do. Why is that? Or you get Jesus' condemnation of the way in which the Jewish leaders practice their piety in relationship to purity and other issues in Luke 11 and in Matthew 23. Part of the point that I'm making by pointing out these passages to show this stuff doesn't happen once, just once. It happens many times in Jesus' ministry. He not only does it once and they end up getting offended, but he comes back again to kind of make the point. And so, and when you look at how Jews explain their commitment to purity and that kind of thing, it basically, there's an intertestamental work called the Letter to Aristeas, in which these practices are described, and they're pictured as avoiding bad things and not catching the depravity that exists in the Gentile world, that kind of thing, the Jew-Gentile things going on here as well. And so there's an ethical concern that Jesus is expressing about hypocrisy. And when he says in the midst of this Mark 7 and Matthew 15 passage that it's not what goes in the person that defiles. Remember, he uses the illustration of it's not what goes in the mouth and comes out of the person that defiles, but it's what comes out of the heart that defiles. And he lists a whole series of relational activities, like murder, strife, envy, etc., things that, interestingly enough, show up in Paul's list on the works of the flesh, in contrast to the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit stuff, if you look at that list of what it is that the Spirit produces, it produces a whole lot of positive relational stuff. That's actually what the fruit of the Spirit is. God's work in our life is designed not only to change the way we relate to God, it's designed to change the way we relate to others. Kind of like the Great Commandment. That was free of charge. That wasn't a part of the lecture. So anyway, Jesus is rejecting the development of the oral law that expands Leviticus 15. He's prioritizing ethical and relational dimensions of the law over its strict liturgical practice. And these are not the comments of a scribe or a prophet ruling on the law. Okay? And so the question is, who has the right to prioritize what's in God's law? Okay, just contemplate that question for a second. Who has the right to prioritize what's in God's law? Who has the right to say a new era is arriving in which you don't put the old wine or the new wine in old wineskins? It's one of the replies in one of these scenes. No, you put new wine in new wineskins. And so Jesus is presenting himself as a supersessor of the Mosaic era as the revealer of a new era. He speaks of God as my Father in personal terms. He says one greater than Moses is here. How do you get greater than Moses? Moses gave us the law. Who is this then who's able to do these things? These are all cultural scripts in which Jesus is playing with stuff out of the law. Who has the right to do that? That's a perfectly good question. And by showing the signs that he shows, he's showing he has the right to do what he's claiming. Otherwise, it would be blasphemy. And it got Jesus into trouble because some people didn't believe he had the right to do the things that he was doing and the right to show the kinds of signs that he was showing. Pretty interesting. Okay, next one. Let's move on here to the next one. The temple cleansing. Now we're coming into the things of the last week. When we talk about cleansing the temple, okay, and the issues associated with that, think about what the temple is. The temple, for a Jewish person, was the most sacred spot on earth. Okay, this is where the Shekinah dwelled. This is where God's glory showed his presence on earth. There's no more sacred spot on all the earth. If you go to the Antonio Museum in Jerusalem, okay, what's called the Fortress of David, which is actually a museum on the history of Jerusalem. If you go there, there's a rabbinic quote as you work your way through all the displays that describes Jerusalem as the navel of the earth. Okay, that's not an insult. Okay? It's a way of saying Jerusalem is the center of the earth. And the reason Jerusalem is the center of the earth to a Jewish person is because that's where the temple is. That's where God's presence can be seen. So Jesus, after he marches into the city in what is called the Triumphal Entry, it's actually the A Triumphal Entry, because no one goes to greet him and lead him in out of the city. Okay, his disciples escort him in, but no one escorts him in. If Pilate had come under the same circumstance, the entire city would have come in and escorted and welcomed him in. That didn't happen. So anyway, so we've got Jesus marching into the city, and the first thing he does is he goes to the temple and he cleanses it. Now, the temple is the most holy place. And the other thing that's important here is that the people in charge of the temple were the Jewish leaders, particularly the Sadducees, who dominated the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. What gives you the right to mess with God's holy space? In fact, after Jesus cleanses the temple, they ask him that question. Who gave you the right to do these things? They're offended by what it is that Jesus does when he claims authority over the holy space that is the temple and talks about how it ought to be run. His answer back is really interesting. He says, you tell me, John the Baptist, who gave him his authority. And so the leaders convene, okay, a reflective meeting on Jesus' question. Okay? And as they're having their little committee meeting, how are we going to reply? You know, while the music is playing in the background, doo, 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 doo. Okay? You know, they're wrestling with what they're going to answer. Okay, they say, well, if we say from man, people won't like that, okay, because they thought he was a prophet. But if we say from God, we're kind of done for. Okay? So they say, we aren't going to answer. Jesus says, I'm not going to answer either, although the very question that he asks tells you what the answer is. So who has authority over the temple? So we said, who has authority over the Sabbath? That's the divine calendar. Who has authority over forgiveness of sins? That's a pretty important area. Who has authority over purity and what makes for purity and what doesn't? That's another good question. Who has authority over sacred space, the temple? And Jesus is checking the box on each one of these. And what you're getting is an expanded resume as you tell the story from earth up. Okay, I've already alluded to the creation thing. Who controls the creation? Okay, that's a God thing. Who's this who's able to command the winds and the waves and they obey him? Okay, Jesus is showing who he is. He's telling the story from the earth up. And so the issue becomes, who has the right to make this kind of a claim on holy space, on the holy space of the temple? And another thing that's going on in the background, I didn't mention this, is the Jewish belief about what would happen in the end time. The belief was that in the end time, not only would God come and judge the nations, okay, and set up righteousness, He would purge the nation of her sin. Because another element in play here, another cultural script is this. How is it that the nations could be ruling Israel in her own land? Can you just think about that question for a second? This is the land God gave us. It's the land God gave His people. How is it that the nations are ruling us and some of our people are dispersed? Well, if you're a good reader of the Old Testament, okay, got Tiberius Rata here who teaches Old Testament at Grace, okay? He's grateful for the next few minutes because it's lifting up the Old Testament here. You got to understand the Old Testament to understand the New. That's kind of the way it works because it's all the Bible and it feeds into itself. So the last 30 seconds were presented by Old Testament professors on behalf of the Old Testament, Tiberius Rata, chairman. Okay? And so when you think about it, Deuteronomy 28 to 32, if you don't keep the law, the nations will deal with you. I will send the nations to deal with you. So the fact that the nations, the Gentiles, the Romans are in the land is an indication the nation is in sin and needs purging, needs cleansing. Well, the belief was, out of that, in prayers like the 18 benedictions, benediction 14, is that the new Davidic king, you prayed for the new Davidic king and you prayed for the cleansing and the purging of Jerusalem at the same time in the same benediction. Why? Because the two thoughts were thought to go together. He's going to come back. He's going to not only defeat the nations, He's going to purge the city. The Psalms of Solomon, very famous text, 17 and 18, intertestamental text, Second Temple Jewish text, if you will, written between the two testaments, proclaims the hope of the arrival of the Messiah who's going to do two things. He's going to establish justice with the nations and judge the nations, and He's going to purge Jerusalem. So when Jesus walks into the temple and purges that holy space, He is claiming, in effect, undertaking a messianic act that says that the new era is here and I am doing the purging work of God. Okay? That's the cultural script. And the question is, who has the authority to do that kind of stuff? And it got Jesus in trouble with the leaders because they didn't think He was qualified. They didn't think He was the right person to be messing with holy space. They didn't think He was the right person to be messing with forgiveness of sins. They didn't think He was the right person to be dealing with purity. They didn't think He was the right person to be messing with the Sabbath. Okay, so we come to the next discussion. Oh, here's the benediction that I told you about in the 18 benedictions. This is benediction 14. And to Jerusalem your city return with mercy and dwell in its midst as you have spoken, and build it as soon as our days to be an everlasting building, and raise up quickly in its midst the throne of David. Blessed are you, Lord, who builds Jerusalem. That's the expression of that hope that I'm talking about that is probably part of the cultural script in the background of the temple cleansing. There are other texts that talk about how the important the temple is that are written in this period. By the way, this Second Temple literature, this intertestamental literature is important, not because it's scripture, but because it shows what Jewish people are thinking and hoping in the time of Jesus. And that's valuable to know. What are their expectations? How did they put the hope together? What were they looking for? And so it's valuable for that reason. So you read these texts not because you regard them as scripture. You read these texts because they give you historical and cultural insight on these cultural scripts. Okay, now, what is this? A picture of the Temple Mount area today viewed from one side looking at the Mount of Olives. That little road that comes kind of about 1/3 the way to your left is a pathway down from Bethany over the Mount of Olives to what will be the eastern gate, okay, of the temple area. Now, why am I taking this picture? I'm taking this picture to talk about the triumphal entry of Jesus, which happened before the temple cleansing, and to raise this question. If Jesus really entered the city and claimed to be a king, then why didn't the Romans arrest him right there on the spot for sedition? Okay, it's a good question. And here's the answer. This picture is taken from about the distance of where the fort was that overlooked the temple in the first century. Let me take you to another picture of the city. So here's the picture of the temple. Okay? And if you look at the corner right, outside the square that is the holy area of the temple, okay, you will see a fort. That fort is the Antonia, by the way. And that was where the Roman soldiers were housed to keep them out of the sacred space of the temple, but also to give them a view into the temple, so should anything happen that they needed to react to, they would be able to react and take care of it. Okay? Now, you'll notice that is on, we're looking to the west from the east, so this is on the northwest corner of the Temple Mount. Okay, now let me go back. This picture, if I tried to take a picture from the northwest corner of Jerusalem today, you couldn't see the Mount of Olives because of everything that's now in between it. So what I did is I went to the equivalent side on the southwest portion, the other end, and took a picture looking at the Mount of Olives because you can see it today. And here's why I did it. I did it because when people are streaming in for the Passover, which is the time of year that Jesus was entering into Jerusalem, they were coming to Jerusalem as part of a pilgrimage feast to participate in the Passover. And people came from all over the nation to come into the city. That's what they were doing. And so as they would come in from a variety of directions and a variety of angles, one of which would be from Bethany into the eastern gate. And they would swarm in, celebratory. Think of a crowd going to a football game. I told you I'd use sports illustrations. When you go to a football game and the crowd is kind of swirling in and they're all coming to the same space at the same time, that's the people from outside the city swarming into the city to celebrate the pilgrimage in the city of Jerusalem. And this is the distance that you're looking at. Now, if you look real carefully, those are cars. Look at how big they are from the distance where the Antonia Fortress is. You've got people coming into the city. Yes, Jesus would have been riding a donkey. The donkey's probably not quite the size of those cars, okay, etc. And people, they all would be coming in celebrating, excited, just like a person's excited when they go to a football game, etc. All right? And as long as nothing violent is happening that you need to keep your eyes on, they're thinking, oh, this is just part of the celebratory mood of the crowd that's coming into the city. That's why they didn't arrest Jesus on the way in. Not only that, it's a pretty good distance. And unless you've got, a microphone like I have on me, you're not going to hear what's going on over there. It's just going to be part of the noise of the crowd, coming to the festival. Just like part of the noise of a crowd entering into coming to a game. Okay? So sometimes when we think about what's going on in the Scripture, we need to kind of step back and visualize the geography of what's going on. There are a lot of scholars who write about the Gospels who've never gone to Israel. Okay? There were a ton of German scholars writing about the New Testament in the early part of the 20th century, skeptically, who had never physically been to Israel to think about and visualize what was going on. So that was free. That had nothing to do with the lecture other than to make a point about skepticism. So wasn't that fun? Okay, here is the temple area. Here's why I want to talk about this, and it is this passage. This is the passage we're going to close with. Well, maybe. Jesus' examination by the Jewish leaders in Mark 14. In this text, what is going on is Jesus is being asked if he's the Christ. And in his reply, he says, yes, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power coming on the clouds of heaven. Okay? And that blew the leadership's gaskets, theological gaskets. Okay? And you're going, why? Okay? It's a cultural script. Here's the cultural script that passage is playing with. Here's what Jesus is saying. You may crucify me, but if you crucify me, you can do with me whatever you want. But God is going to vindicate me. And when God vindicates me, I will have an email address. And the email address will be www.righthandofgod.com. Okay? I'm going to seat the Son of Man at the right hand of the Father. Now, you're a Jew. I have a ring on my finger, okay? And it is the Shema, you know, the call. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Okay? Deuteronomy 6:4. Here's the question. Who gets to sit with God in heaven and share his throne? Okay? That's a good question to a Jew. Okay? They hear it and they go, oy vey! Okay? How can that be? But notice what Jesus is claiming. Jesus is claiming that God is going to do that for him. Okay? Yes, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming with the clouds of heaven. How's that going to happen? Well, the early church, in its message, declared Jesus was raised up by God. God's responsible for that. Now, if God does it, are you going to complain? See where that puts us? So, if you ask who Jesus is, when we get to the end of the gospel, remember we're telling the story from the earth up? This passage kind of, how can I say it? It kind of breaks the glass ceiling. Okay, as you're moving from the earth up, Jesus just keeps going. That crashing sound you hear is the glass breaking as he's on the way to the right hand of God. And when he parks there and he starts distributing blessings, Acts 2, he's received from the Father that which you see and hear, and he's poured out this Spirit which God promised. You're seeing him act from the side of God. Jesus told you where he's parked. I mean, that's, how nice. Jesus gave you his parking place after the resurrection. Okay, the Germans have a wonderful word for a park place. It's called Parkplatz. Okay, I like that. It just sounds right. Okay? Yeah, Jesus has a Parkplatz right there by the right hand of God. Oh, by the way, that is figurative in case you didn't notice, because, I mean, does God have a right hand? Yeah, okay, it's Saturday. I know, it's a weekend. Okay, I shouldn't make you think so hard. So the point is, they're there with God, and God is vindicating me. God is doing this, and how can you know I'm the Messiah? You will be able to know for sure I'm the Messiah by what God does with me after you've crucified me. It's actually not just an answer to a question, it's a prediction of what God's going to do. And it's an indication that God is going to show who Jesus is versus him talking about who he is. And it's all based on cultural scripts. So what got Jesus into trouble, here's the point. What got Jesus into trouble was that he acted out certain cultural scripts that triggered theological significance for his audience, which, and here's the irony, they got it, but they didn't get it. Okay? They understood what he was claiming by what he was doing and what its theological message was, but because they didn't buy who he was, they thought it was blasphemy rather than the truth, and it got Jesus into trouble. But it also is telling the story of Jesus from the earth up by working with categories that show us culturally how Jesus is showing who he is. Which is why some of these miracles that go with some of these actions are called signs. They are, and now I'm being clever, PowerPoints. Okay? They are points about Jesus' power and his authority and where it comes from. And they're designed to be seen as PowerPoints. They are signs. They are audio visuals indicating who he is and what he's doing through the cultural scripts that we are dealing with. Now, I want to make one more point before I'm done. Okay, you are now looking at a picture of a model of first century Jerusalem in the temple. And we are facing in the direction that the Shekinah faces towards the eastern gate. So when you're coming down the road, remember I said the road runs into the eastern gate? You're seeing the road enter into the eastern gate that's right in front of the Holy of Holies. That's the picture that you have. To the right side of the Shekinah in first century Israel is the area, see the little tiled roof area over there on what's called the southern, below that are what's called the southern steps. Okay? So you're looking to where the top, on the place next to that is called the City of David. Okay? Now why is that important? The City of David is located on the right hand of where the Shekinah is pointing when it points out this way. Okay? So, I wish I could walk over there, but I can't. So, imagine the picture behind me. Okay? And to the right side of the Shekinah, as it faces out, is the City of David. That's where the right hand of God language comes from. That Jesus alludes to because he's alluding to Psalm 110. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Because the idea of being at the right hand of God ultimately is a picture of the kingship, the messiahship of Jesus. Only now this messiahship isn't represented as being on the earth in the city of Jerusalem. Now we're talking about the real presence of God. Okay, that's also feeding into that background. So when Jesus says, yes, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, he is evoking both kingship imagery as well as this shared authority with God imagery that answers who he is. And it's even pictured in the geography of the city of Jerusalem. That's my point. So here's what we've said. Herb, we're about ready for questions. What we're saying is this. I was going to go through a whole thing of, is his claim of personal authority is the way Jesus shows who he is. This is how he makes the case for who he is from the earth up. And whether we're talking about the Sabbath, which is God's day, or we're talking about forgiveness, only God can forgive sins, or we're talking about purity, who makes those calls of defining what purity is or isn't, or we're talking about sacred space of the temple, who has authority over the temple, or we're speaking about one who will be vindicated and judged. Oh, one other thing. When he says, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power coming on the clouds of heaven, he's alluding also to Daniel 7. Daniel 7, the Son of Man rides the clouds. He exercises. He's a human being who does divine things by riding the clouds. And you know what he's going on the clouds to do? He's going to the Ancient of Days. You know what he's going to receive from the Ancient of Days? Judgment, authority. So part of what Jesus is saying is this in this cultural script. Not only am I who I claim to be, not only is God going to vindicate me and take me to his right hand, but you may be judging me now, but I'm here to tell you there's coming a time when I'm going to judge you. That got Jesus into trouble. When you wrap that entire claim together into one huge claim, you know what the high priest said? Because they didn't believe Jesus was qualified to do what he was saying. They understood what he was saying. They theologically got it. And they said, because they didn't believe who he was, that's blasphemy. So here's where we are when we come to the end of the story. Jesus is either who he claims to be, one in a gazillion, someone who sits at the right hand of God, someone who possesses judgment authority, someone who has authority over the Sabbath, someone who has authority over the creation, someone who has authority over forgiveness of sins, someone who has authority over purity, someone who has authority over temple, someone who is the judge, or it's blasphemy. The one place you cannot leave Jesus is he's a religious great. He's a prophet like other prophets. He will not let you park there. That's where our culture wants to put Jesus, or many in our culture do. He's a religious great like a whole lot of other religious greats. He's one among many. No, he's one in a gazillion. He's all by himself over here. And he's either who he claims to be, or he couldn't be more dastardly. The Jewish leadership had the choice right. They made the wrong choice. So that's what got Jesus into trouble. The exercise of cultural scripts, which indicated by what Jesus was doing who he was. He showed who he was more than talking about who he was. At least that's the case in the Synoptic Gospels. And I hope this has kind of been a revealing and disclosing time for you to think about in terms of what it is that Jesus is doing.
Thank you for joining with us as we listen to Darrell talk about the importance of interpreting the Gospels in light of their historical and cultural setting. I trust you will join with us in Darrell's third session as he talks about understanding the Gospels, particularly as he concerns himself with minding the gap from the event to the Gospel writings. In the meantime, I trust you will have a great day.